This is a paper called Jacques Lacan, Signification and Representation. It's for a symposium on the role of the unconscious in the architectural imagination, sponsored by the Institute for Psychoanalytic Studies in Architecture. My name is Shannon Hendrix. Jacques Lacan applies Sigmund Freud's dream analysis to the structure of the unconscious in linguistic terms in the Rome Discourse of 1953, The Function of Language in Psychoanalysis. He announces, take up the work of Freud again at the Traum du Temps, or the interpretation of dreams, to remind yourself that the dream has the structure of a sentence, or rather, to stick to the letter of the word of a rebus, or in other words, it has the structure of a form of writing, of which the child's dream represents the primordial ideography and which, in the adult, reproduces the simultaneously phonetic and symbolic use of signifying elements, which can also be found in the hieroglyphics of ancient Egypt and in the characters still used in China, as Lacan wrote. The symbolic function of the signifying elements is of less importance than the linguistic mechanisms with which the dream is written, the phonetic elements. The phonetic elements constitute the role of the symbolic in the unconscious as opposed to the imaginary, but of course depend on the role of the imaginary, the image formation in consciousness. But even this is no more than the deciphering of the instrument, Lacan says. The important part begins with the translation of the text. The important part, which Freud tells us is given in the verbal elaboration of the dream, which is a function of conscious reason. In other words, in its rhetoric. Ellipsis and pleonasm, hyperbaton or solipsis, regression, repetition, apposition, these are the syntactical displacements, along with metaphor, catachresis, antinomousis, allegory, metonymy, and synecdoche. These are the semantic condensations in which Freud teaches us to read the intentious, ostentatious or demonstrative, dissimulating or persuasive, retaliatory or seductive, out of which the subject modulates his oneiric discourse, Lacan describes. Several of these linguistic mechanisms operate in the formation of dream images, in that these are the mechanisms which allow the subject to moderate the dream discourse. They are not mechanisms of the dream itself, but rather the conscious reading of the dream. Ellipsis involves the omission of a word in a syntax without altering the signification. A pleonasm is the use of more words than are necessary for the signification. A solipsis is the use of a word in a syntax which agrees with one word in the syntax grammatically, but not another. An apposition is the placing of a word in a sentence to explain another word. A catachresis is the incorrect use of a word. An antinomousis is the use of a title instead of a name. These are the primary condensations and displacements, along with metaphor and metonymy, which are active in both language and dream construction. They can all be used as strategies in architectural composition. Solipsis can be found in the overlay of grids, for example, where a grid which is rotated or shifted might correspond to one underlying grid in a certain way, but not to another. Such an overlaying can result in the creation of a transformational relation. The solipsis can act as the point du capitaine in the signifying chain, or the point at which the overlay of the grids reveals an underlying conceptual structure, as it does in language. An apposition would be one element of a grid or scheme which is designed to correspond to another grid or scheme, as in a previous psi condition. The apposition may be the doubling of an element, a self-repetition which reveals the regression of another element, as in metaphor. A catachresis would be that element in a grid or scheme which is purposefully out of place, as often happens in the dream. The catachresis reveals the self-enclosure of the signifying system of the language, and the production of nonsense, as in metonymy. An antinomicist would be the substitution of a type form for a form in the architectural composition to stage the dialectic between the metaphysic of the architecture and the signifiance in which it is engaged, or signification, the dialectic between the symbolic and the imaginary. The coexistence of phonetic and symbolic elements in the writing of the dream is the coexistence of the imaginary and symbolic, and the coexistence of the mnemic residue of the visual perception and the mnemic residue of the auditory perception, the traces interwoven into the language of the unconscious. The visual residue is the thing presentation, the Sachvorstellung or Dingvorstellung, and the auditory residue is the word presentation, the Wortvorstellung, and the formation of the dream image, which is described by Freud as a transition from the latent content to the visual image of the dream, and a concern for representability, or Rücksichtdarstellbarkeit, as described by Lacan, and the agency of the letter in the unconscious, or reason since Freud. The coexistence of the Sachvorstellung and the Wortvorstellung in the Rücksichtdarstellbarkeit in the writing of the dream is a double inscription, or Niederschrift, which involves condensation and displacement, and which corresponds to the coexistence of conscious and repressed or unconscious images which may occur in the preconscious, or the memory of the dream, and which constitutes the structure of conscious language and the mechanisms of metaphor and metonymy in particular. The Niederschrift is the quality of the hieroglyph, the simultaneity of the word and the image, which would be impossible to comprehend by someone within the framework of modern linguistic usage. While the writing of the dream can be seen in terms of a linguistic structure, such a writing exceeds the possibility of modern language and communication. In the symbolic of Lacan, a representation can be a cathexis of an image and a word, while in the imaginary, a presentation is only an image. In the dialectical synthesis, which only architecture can achieve, the dialectic between reason and what is other to reason, which occurs within reason itself. Such a dialectical synthesis is a synthesis of subjective and objective spirit and absolute spirit in the phenomenology of spirit of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. As subjective spirit, or the virtual, becomes objective spirit, or the real, the subjective spirit comes to be seen as reality, the inner being of the world, which assumes objective determinate form and enters into relations with itself. It is externality or otherness and exists for self, as Hegel writes in the Phenomenology of Spirit. The real in architecture, the surface aspect, is always seen as the objective form of the virtual, the deep aspect, and the expectation of representation in the symbolic. As objective form, the real in architecture, the object, is then seen as externality or otherness in relation to the subject, enacting the subject-object dialectic. As externality or otherness, though, the object retains its relation to the idea. The subjective spirit is implicit in its nature as self-contained or an sich. It does not exist in the object and does not exhibit the qualities of the object in reason, of differentiation in the particular, until the initial doubling of itself as otherness or externality, as in the primordial dehiscence of thought alienating itself from its own being, the primordial dehiscence of the subject between the imaginary and the symbolic in the mirror stage, which permanently alienates the subject from itself. Such a dehiscence is enacted in architecture between the virtual and the real. Subjective spirit becomes objective spirit, but as objective spirit it is immediately negated. Thought becomes self-reflected in the object, which is the product of its doubling, as all objects are given to reason in perception and the symbolic. Reason itself, the virtual, is the objective self-reflection of thought, thought in self-consciousness resulting from the primordial dehiscence, the self-alienation of thought in the phenomenal world. Spirit becomes self-conscious through perception or picture thinking, as in the recognition by the subject of itself in the mirror stage. Perception consists of moments of thought appearing as completely independent sides which are externally connected with each other, as Hegel describes differentiation in reason. Perception becomes the middle term between the virtual and the real, between the universal in thought and the particular in the object. As such, perception is the doubling of the self-consciousness of thought, the consciousness of passing into otherness, for Hegel. The negation of thought in the phenomenal through perception, the negation of the virtual in the real, is the dialectical synthesis of the virtual and the real, the absolute spirit of Hegel. Absolute spirit is, as Hegel describes, the negativity of thought, or negativity as it is in itself in essence, i.e., simple essence is absolute difference from itself, or its pure othering of itself. As the subject enters into the symbolic, into language, it is negated in the self-doubling of its reason. In architecture, the synthesis of the virtual and the real, which can only take place in the mind, is the negation of the virtual in the real in absolute otherness and externality. The negation of the virtual in the real can only take place in the virtual. Through the doubling and self-negation of thought and its reabsorption of its negation into itself, the subject is elided. Such negation in architecture is as the chora, the place which cannot be a place, because it only exists as the self-negation of the idea of place, the self-negation of the subject. Lacan compares the distortion or Entstellung described by Freud in dream work to the glissement in signification, the sliding of the signified under the signifier in the course of the signifying chain. In the gap between what is perceived and what is represented in the dream as the mnemic residue of perception, a direct connection is lost in the process of distortion, as the connection is lost between the signifier and the signified in language. Freud's dream condensation, or Verdichtung, is compared to the combination of signifiers and metaphor. Displacement, or Verschiebung, is compared to the transfer of signification and metonymy, where the correspondence between signifier and signified is maintained, but shifted and rendered nonsensical. The only difference between the mechanisms in language and the mechanisms in the dream work is the difference between the intentions of communication and the consideration of representability, the Rücksicht auf Darstellbarkeit, which is also a mechanism of communication, which combines both word presentation and thing presentation in conscious discourse. The elision of the signified in the connection between signifier and signified, or signifier and signifier, in both the dream and conscious discourse, creates absence in language and representation by forcing the signifier to refer back to the previous signifier. In doing so, it represents the subject, and the point de capitaine is arrived at in the anticipation of the subject in the signifying chain. It is that which produces desire in language, which is the desire of the other, with a big O, and the attempt to regain the absence, to relocate the subject. The absence of the subject in language follows the objectification of the ideal ego, and the insertion of the subject in language following mirror stage identification. The subject becomes objectified in the dialectic of the identification with the other, according to Lacan, as spirit does for Hegel an objective spirit. The subject becomes a function of the universal, of concept and language, as it does for Hegel in the movement from the particular to the universal. The ideal ego, prior to language, becomes inaccessible to the subject in language. The relation between the subject and language, the symbolic, and the ideal ego, the imaginary, is an asymptotic one. The wall of language becomes a barrier to the self-identification of the subject, as it is to the realization of the subject for Hegel, the synthesis of the dialectic in absolute spirit. The subject is doubled and self-alienated in the symbolic of Lacan, as the subject is doubled and self-alienated in reason in the phenomenology of spirit. The premise of the doubling of the subject in language is the dialectic of self-consciousness, the elision of the particular in the universal, but in the insertion in the other, the Lacanian subject is discentered from consciousness, that in which the subject identifies itself in the cogito. In the symbolic, the self-identification of the subject is defined by meconnaissance rather than consciousness. The symbolic is an order which can only be eccentric in relation to any bringing to realization of the consciousness of self, according to Lacan. The dialectic of consciousness itself becomes other to the subject as it is defined in the symbolic, which precludes the possibility of a dialectical synthesis, a totality, however much it may be presented in the phenomenology as containing its own negation. The subject can only be seen as divided. For Hegel, the division or alienation of the subject is synonymous with its formation. It is through the alienation of reason to itself that the subject discovers itself in its own dehiscence. In the Hegelian subject, existence, or being for self, is set against nothingness, or being in itself, which is not present in existence, or reality is given by language, as the being in itself of the Lacanian subject is not present in language. Being in itself, subjective spirit, is synthesized into the dialectic of reason, and in that way it becomes other to itself as fragmented being, as in the dialectical synthesis of the real and virtual in architecture. As reason returns to itself from the other in the dialectic, it discovers itself simultaneously as absolute negativity and infinite self-affirmation, as described by Hegel in the philosophy of mind. Reason is the perpetual self-affirmation of absolute negativity, the perpetuation of the externality of language in relation to the subject, or the externality of architectural form, the otherness of the subject in relation to the symbolic. In the phenomenology, the absolute certitude of self changes therefore immediately, for it is as consciousness into a dying echo in the objectivity of its being for itself. But the world thus created is its discourse, which it has heard similarly non-immediately, and whose echo keeps on coming back to it, Hegel writes. The echo is subjective spirit, which can be seen as the unconscious, the absence which is present in the discourse and language. Discourse, subjective spirit, is seen as something which is always already in relation to the subject, which is other to it. The subject is present in discourse only as a non-presence. Consciousness is only given by that which is other to it, which becomes the unconscious in the science of the letter. In the Rome discourse, Lacan observes, I identify myself in language, but only by losing myself in it like an object, the being for self of objective spirit. What is realized in my history is not the past definite of what was, since it is no more, or even the present perfect of what has been and what I am, but the future anterior of what I shall have been for what I am in the process of becoming. Lacan explains, memory or perception cannot establish presence in language. The present perfect of the subject as a completion is impossible in language. The subject is objectified in language as that which is in the process of becoming but has not yet become, which is nothing, non-being, as the signifier presents the subject to the next signifier in the chain of signification. The presence of the subject in language is presence as motion. In the paradox of Zeno, the gap between the positions of the objects as the gap between the signifiers, which always defines a particular place as it is translated into a universal concept, reason, and language. Freud translates the self-negation of reason in Hegel as a symptom of unconscious repression. In the essay Negation of 1925, the content of a repressed presentation or thought can thus make its way through to consciousness on the condition that it lets itself be negated. The denial is a way to take cognizance of what is repressed. Indeed, it is already a lifting and conserving of the repression, but not for all that an acceptance of what is repressed, Freud says. The Freudian unconscious is thus seen as being present in the Hegelian dialectic. in the form of repression as a symptom of self-negation, which is given by the insertion of the subject in the symbolic and the loss of the other to reason, the unconscious, in the objectification of reason and the loss of the imaginary subject in the totality of the other, with a big O. The symbolic becomes primary because it makes the ordering of reality possible in the entrance of the subject into language. An example of this is the forked dog game described by Freud, the gone here game enacted by the infant to compensate for the temporary departure of the mother. Freud explains, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the interpretation of the game then became obvious. It was related to the child's great cultural achievement, the instinctual renunciation, that is, the renunciation of instinctual satisfaction, which he had made in allowing his mother to go away without protesting. He compensated himself for this, as it were, by himself staging the disappearance and return of the objects within his reach. In the game language, the ordering of reality in the symbolic became a substitution for the instinctual displeasure which the infant feels at the departure of its mother, as well as the instinctual joy which the infant feels upon her return, or the anticipation of that joy. The departure of the mother is enacted in anticipation of the return in order to simulate the instinctual feeling in language. As soon as the linguistic game is constructed, the infant becomes a subject of the game, and the linguistic construction replaces the actual relation with the mother. Both the infant and the mother are defined as subjects by the big other, by the network of relations which connect them and determine them in language, the ordering of reality. Language assumes a primacy over perception, and the word becomes more important than the imago as the anchoring point of the subject. The unconscious, then, is defined by Lacan as that part of the concrete discourse, insofar as it is trans-individual, that is not at the disposal of the subject in re-establishing the continuity of his conscious discourse. As the subject becomes redefined to itself in relation to the big other in the symbolic, it loses its definition of itself in relation to itself in the imaginary. The absence of the subject, the absence in language, is perpetually recreated in language, as in the forked dog game of the infant, in which is inscribed the trace of presence, the imaginary presence in the symbolic, the world of meaning of a particular language in which the world of things will come to be arranged, Lacan says. The archetypal form of Plato, for example, the construction of a metaphysical language, is the recreation of such a reality, the transposition of a language which is already inscribed with the deceptive totality of a system which ensures being. As in the metaphysic, though that which becomes embodied only by being the trace of a nothingness, and whose support cannot thereafter be impaired, the concept, saving the duration of what passes by, as in Zeno's paradox, engenders the thing. The Platonic archetypal form is the trace of a nothingness, the absence in perception as given by the construction of perception and reason in the entrance into the symbolic. It is the world of words that creates the world of things, for Lacan, in the concept, in the process of perception, and in the structuring of the unconscious as given by the dream. The thing is given by concept as an everlasting possession from Thucydides, as an archetype, thus the metaphysical structure of reason. Man speaks, then, but it is because the symbol has made him man, Lacan says, even prior to his birth. As the subject is both an absence in language and an always already presence in that absence, so the subject is an always already presence in history. As the subject is determined by language, so the subject is determined by history. In Reason and History, Hegel defined the subject in history as an antithesis to the natural world. History, like the subject, begins its purpose as the realization of spirit, being in itself, or an sich, the unconscious. History is the process of making conscious the unconscious, the transition from subjective to objective spirit. Historical events are seen as mechanisms towards bringing the unconscious to consciousness and conscious reason. History is the stage on which are acted out the events of the constructive reality of mind, language and the symbolic, in its self-alienation from nature and from its other, the unconscious, and objective spirit. The individual will is seen as the product of a culture, as the particular is a product of the universal, the thing is a product of the word. The individual historical subject can only act in relation to its position in history and the big other. The individual does not invent his own content. He is what he is by acting out the universal as his own content. Hegel says, that is to say, the unconscious is a discourse of the big other. Any action which contributes to the course of the historical development of a culture on the part of an individual is a consequence of that individual interpreting and carrying out the universal will of the culture, the concept of the culture in particular events. This is especially true in artistic activity. A work of art only has resonance insofar as it reflects the universal will of the culture in the course of history. The identity of the subject cannot be found within the infinity of reflection that the mirage of consciousness consists of, as Lacan describes. Ego identity is an indefinite play of reflections between mirrors in which the speaking subject is trapped without access to the supposed progress of interiority in which the subject sees itself constituted in meconnaissance. The self-alienation of reason and objective spirit precludes access to the subjective spirit of the subject prior to reason. The subject becomes that which is defined by George Bataille in The Pineal Eye as enclosed in the degrading chains of logic, or enclosed systems assigned to life by reasonable conceptions, as described in the notion of expenditure. For Bataille, the subject is defined in the struggle with the symbolic, the inescapable signifying structure of human thought. In such a struggle, being is ungraspable. It is only grasped in error, as in meconnaissance. The subject is defined by the mirror reflections in which it is trapped, which define to it the relationship between the self and the other as one of simulacrum, as in architecture, the reflection of a reflection with nothing being reflected, which is the chora in language as trace or point de capiton, the point of escape from a play of mirror reflections, which is a myth. The subject is as the subject in the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, if the cave is taken as representation of the self. The subject is a prisoner in the self as given by language, as the prisoners in the cave in the Republic are unable to see anything of themselves or their fellows except the shadows thrown by the fire on the wall of the cave opposite them, as Plato described. The shadows on the wall of the cave are the others, or collectively the big other, and the fire is the unconscious. The fire is separated from the cave by a curtain wall built along the road, which is like a screen at puppet shows between the operator and their audience. Plato said, the curtain wall is the wall of language through which the unconscious is filtered. The realm revealed by light, perception, and language corresponds to the prison in which the subject is caught in the play of reflections, and the light of the fire in the prison to the power of the sun, the unconscious. For Plato, the ascent into the upper world and the sight of the objects there, on the other side of the curtain wall, that is, on the other side of language, is the upward progress of the mind into the intelligible reason, an understanding of the self outside of perception and language, and the unconscious, as it is for Lacan and the imaginary, pure form identification prior to language. In the constitution of the symbolic, the imaginary ego disintegrates, and the symbolic shields the subject from that disintegration. The objects of the imaginary are the objects structured by perception, as in the shadows on the wall of the cave. For Bataille, the imaginary entails a homogeneous representation of perceived reality wherein existence is a neatly defined itinerary from one practical sign to another, and acts undertaken with some rational end are only servile responses to a necessity, as he described in the imaginary ego and conscious reason. Lacan explains, it is thus that the functions of mastery, which we incorrectly call the synthesizing functions of the ego, established on the basis of a libidinal alienation, the alienation of the imaginary ego, the development that follows from it, namely, what I once called the paranoid principle of human knowledge, according to which its objects are subjugated to a law of imaginary reduplication, evoking the homologation of an endless series of notaries. Lacan writes, as in the anticipation of representation and architecture, the symbolic is predicated on a relation to the other person which is mutually self-sustaining and mutually exclusive of imaginary identification. The imaginary self is thus delimited in the necessity of the other, and the necessity of the big other is a homogeneous and functionary self in the relation between the notary of the profession to the other notary and the notary to the client. But for me, writes Lacan, the decisive signification of the alienation that constitutes the urbild of the ego appears in the relation of exclusion that then structures the dual relation of ego to ego. The imaginary ego is reaffirmed by the other person in its functionalism and can never be predicated on anything other than a relation to the other person, the other notary in the profession, as in the objective spirit of Hegel, which establishes the self as other, as that which is not the other, in an irresoluble dialectic which mirrors the structure of reason in which the symbolic is established. In Bataille's desire to escape the cycle of functionalism created by the imaginary ego and the other, to search for something in life which is other to it. It is Bataille's desire. As he writes in Eroticism, Death, and Sensuality, there is in nature and there subsists in man a movement which always exceeds the bounds that can never be anything but partially reduced to order. We are generally unable to grasp it. Indeed, it is by definition that which can never be grasped, but we are conscious of being in its power. The universe that bears us along answers no purpose that reason defines. For Lacan, the movement is the movement of the unconscious, that which exceeds the bounds of conscious reason, which is unable to be grasped, that is exterior to the universe of the symbolic, the universe of language, a universe which cannot answer to its own premise because it is only a partial reality. For Bataille and the notion of expenditure, human life cannot in any way be limited to the closed systems assigned to it by reasonable conceptions. The immense travail of recklessness, discharge, and upheaval that constitutes life could be expressed by stating that life starts only with the deficit of these systems. Human life cannot be limited by conscious reason. The discharge and upheaval within the systems of reason are the manifestations of the unconscious and conscious thought, and manifestations of the imaginary imago, the primordial self prior to language, which is made present in the deficit of the systems of reason, and the absences, gaps, scodomata, and meconnaissance that reveal the limitations of reason. In The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Bataille endorses acts undertaken in pursuit of seductive images of chance, which are the only ones that respond to the need to live like a flame. The seductive images of chance are the imaginary imago, that which exceeds reason in the unconscious. Bataille seeks, as described in the pineal eye, a transgression of the degrading chains of logic of conscious thought, which constitute the imaginary ego. He seeks a new laceration within a lacerated nature, access to the imaginary and the unconscious. For Lacan, the self-identification of the subject, and perhaps the transgression of the imaginary order, begins when the subject recognizes and therefore distinguishes his action in each of these two registers, the imaginary and symbolic. Lacan writes, and if he is to know why he intervenes, at what moment the opportunity presents itself, and how to seize it. This is accomplished in the understanding of the relation between the subject and the other person, in distinction from the relation between the subject and the big other, that is, language. The prime condition for this, Lacan says, is that he should be thoroughly imbued with the radical difference between the big other to which his speech must be addressed, and that second other who is the individual that he sees before him, and from whom and by means of whom the first speaks to him in the discourse that he holds before him. Such recognition would enable the subject to accomplish the annulling of his existence when he is the other with a small o, and then he will be able to be he to whom this discourse is addressed, Lacan says. This is not an easy task because, as has been seen, the relation of the subject to the other person is determined by the relation of the subject to the big other, and the imaginary identification that the subject might have with the other person has been subsumed by the symbolic identification with the big other, which has objectified the imaginary identification into a dialectical product of reason. Thus, the imaginary shaping of the subject by desires more or less fixed or regressed in the relation to the object is too inadequate and partial to provide the key to it, Lacan writes. As Freud established the extent to which linguistic discourse determines unconscious activity, the structure of the big other has already played a role in the primordial constitution of the imaginary ego, as seen in the original conflict of the mirror stage between Gestalt object identification, the imago, and the fragmentation of experience. The big other is the locus in which is constituted the I who speaks to him who hears, that which is said by the one being already the reply. Lacan says, the function of the subject in language is always already objectified in the anticipation of signification, but the big other extends into the subject beyond language itself, in the constitution of the subject as it enters into language. Imaginary desire, the primordial ego, is embedded in a signifier that has been taken possession of by repression, Lacan says, as manifest in the desire for recognition. The relation between the subject and the other person is dictated by the relation between the subject and the big other, insofar as the linguistic mechanisms of repression, displacement, and distortion are operative both in the unconscious and in conscious discourse. The unconscious appears in conscious discourse through the primary repression of language, which is also a mechanism of unconscious activity, as shown in the analysis of dreams. As the unconscious is the discourse of the other, the big other, the relation between the subject and the other person, on both the symbolic and imaginary level, is a relation determined by the big other, despite what might be given by the mirage of consciousness and perception. A transgression of the big other would be useless without an understanding of how the other person is constituted by the big other and how the imaginary imago is transformed in the mirror stage. The primordial ego, which is formed prior to the mirror stage, is based on an object identification which is not interceded by a relation to the self as object, a relation which is formed during the mirror stage and which is in conflict with the fragmentary experiences of primary object identification, and which influences the symbolic and the entrance of the subject into language. The ideal ego is the secondary imaginary ego, and it serves as a link between the imaginary imago and the symbolic. The retention of the Gestalt ideal ego in the subject is a form of resistance to the primary imaginary ego, of object identification prior to the intercession of the subject, and the resistance is sustained by the subject's relation to the other, which makes the differentiation between the relation of the subject to the other person and the big other more difficult. As the ideal ego becomes a function of the big other, the primary imaginary ego becomes inaccessible to conscious thought. As a link between the imaginary and symbolic, the ideal ego is both a permanence and totality, and a fragmentation and ambiguity in the self-identity of the subject, a dialectic stage in architecture. The ideal ego is as reinforced by the gaze or regard of the other person in perception as it is by enunciation of the subject by the other person in the anticipation of presence. The self-perception of the subject as image in relation to the other person is thus as illusory as the self-perception of the subject as name in relation to the other as object. The subject is objectified and alighted in anticipation of the gaze in the same way that the subject is alighted in the signifying chain of language. The participation of the subject as an image or body in the big other is the same as the participation of the subject as a name in the big other, as perception is a product of language. Both the gaze and the voice, primordial object identification, and auditory perception, as mnemic residues, are present in the primary imaginary ego, pre-mirror stage experience, as fragmentary objects. They can surface in dreams, hallucinations, or linguistic mishaps. Ellipsis, pleonasm, solipsis, apposition, catachresis, antonomasis, which reveal the unconscious and which threaten the mirage of the totality of the ideal ego. The basis of the symbolic is the meconnaissance, which leads it to mistake itself for a totality in relation to the fragmentary primordial ego. The subject who thinks he can accede to himself by designating himself in the statement is no more than such an object, Lacan says, fragmentary and non-representational. The repression of the subject is thus given by both its definition in the big other and the false identity fixations of the ideal ego. The ideal ego is both a constituent of the big other, as the mirror stage experience influences the development of language, and in rivalry with the big other as a pre-linguistic imaginary construct. It is nevertheless subject to the relation to the other person in the anticipation of recognition and signification, thus the problematic situation of the subject in the desire to transgress the big other. Language is the source of meconnaissance in the community of symbols into which the subject is inserted. In its participation in the big other, the ego misrecognizes its own unconscious, but it is the unconscious which constitutes the ego, the imaginary function. The subject is eccentric to the ego, to its own mechanisms of thinking, and does not know what it is. It is impossible for the subject to know itself, given the dichotomy of the imaginary and symbolic. The knowledge on the part of the subject of its unconscious is replaced by the illusion of consciousness, the mirage of the cogito, the thinking subject. The subject decenters itself in its commitment to language. Science and technology are manifestations of the mechanisms of language, symbolic structures, into which the subject inserts itself and through which the subject loses itself. Language itself is as a machine in that it detaches itself from the subject and objectifies the subject in its detachment. In language, in its objectification, the subject is fragmented and disconnected, but the ego of the subject retains the virtual and alienated unity given by the gestalt image of the ideal ego in the mirror stage. The subject is divided in language and further divided by the relation between language and the object, between the big other and the other person. The ego is in the beginning an imaginary function, but is then objectified as a symbolic function in the entrance of the subject into language. The imaginary ego reinforces itself in the image of the other person, while the symbolic reinforces itself in the fragmentary and dispersed structure of language. The subject in language is a body in pieces, as Lacan describes, as a product of the linguistic structure of perception and the linguistic structure of the unconscious. The body image of the symbolic and the body image of the primordial imaginary ego prior to the mirror stage are in contrast to the body image of the ideal ego of the imaginary, a unified body which is reinforced in the dream. The dream contains the dialectic of the imaginary and symbolic. The body of the other appears in the dream to reinforce the body image of the ideal ego of the subject, but the unified body is inserted into a fragmented structure which reflects the structure of language, the structure of the big other. The dream is an imaginary iridescence of shifting changes, interplays of forms, varieties of viewpoints, condensations and displacements, which fragments the unified possibility of experience as language fragments the body, the ideal ego of the subject. The fragmentation of the ideal ego occurs in decomposition and architecture, wherein architecture is experienced as shifting changes, interplays of forms, varieties of viewpoints, condensations and displacements. The architecture can be read almost as a dream, as an imaginary iridescent, a composition which corresponds to a fragmented and distorted form of logic, which is the product of the intersection of the imaginary and symbolic, the vestiges of imaginary object identification floating in the indecipherable matrix of the symbolic, and the unconscious which is unavailable to conscious thought. The vestiges of imaginary object identification are seen as prior conditions in relation to a conceptual matrix in decomposition and architecture. The intersection between the prior conditions and the conceptual matrix guarantee the impossibility of a unified subject or stable state of perception, as conscious thought is interrupted and disturbed by the ineffable presence of the inaccessible unconscious, causing instability and vacillation, as in the dream. The composition and architecture can exceed conscious reason and perception, as the dream exceeds conscious reason and perception, and the layers of linguistic matrices combine with the fragments of object identification and sense experience. The architecture enacts the unconscious as the ineffable and inaccessible and rational thought, the mystery of the universe within the human subject, which makes it impossible for the subject to be other than divided and self-alienated. In the inaccessibility of conscious reason to the unconscious, there is no possibility of the origin of reason or the subject. The unconscious prevents conscious reason from knowing itself, as given by the imaginary iridescence of the dream and the disruptions in language caused by the unconscious and conscious discourse. The unconscious is thus always manifested as that which vacillates in a split in the subject, Lacan says, between the imaginary and the symbolic, and the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. If the unconscious is structured like a language, then its structuring is one of discontinuity, impediment, vacillation, a strange temporality. It has been seen how the vacillation and the split of the subject is manifest in metaphor, in metonymy and language, and the relation between the signifier and the signified, the subject and the other. The unconscious is seen as a primordial cut in thought. The function of the unconscious is in profound, initial, inaugural relation with the function of the concept of the unbegriff or begriff or idea of the original namely the cut, Lacan describes, which is the arché of the bar between the signifier and the signified, and the point du capital in language. The function of the subject is predicated on the cut, the split, which manifests itself in a temporal pulsation in language, as the subject is elided and then reemerges from underneath the bar between the signifier and the signified. Language can only establish the possibility of the presence of the subject temporarily, unless the temporality of the unconscious is a pulsative one in the coming and going of the illusion of consciousness. The dialectic of the ego and the big other, the circuit in which the subject becomes a link, is the dialectic of the ego and the unconscious. The subject can only experience itself in the big other, in the unconscious, as in pieces, decomposed. The perception consciousness system is itself fragmented and unknowable in its entirety to the subject, which is divided in the symbolic. As the subject reaffirms its ideal ego in the other person, in the imaginary function of the ego, it has consciousness, but the consciousness is only a reflection, the product of a play of reflections given by perception, as in the allegory of the cave of Plato. The consciousness of the subject is only the consciousness of the other person. Consciousness becomes self-consciousness as it becomes objectified in the big other, as objective spirit becomes subjective spirit for Hegel, but as such consciousness only sees itself as the consciousness of the other person. Consciousness cannot see itself, the subject cannot identify itself in language, it is only present to itself as an absence. This is what gives you the illusion that consciousness is transparent to itself, Lacan writes. We aren't present in the reflection. To see the reflection, we are in the consciousness of the other person. This is illustrated in the painting Las Meninas of Diego Velázquez from the 17th century. The viewer of the painting is in the place of the subject of the painting, which is the King and Queen of Spain, whose portrait is being painted by the painter off to the left. The painting presents the process of the royal portrait being painted from the point of view of the sitters. A reflection of the King and Queen is visible in a mirror on a wall in the background. When the viewer of the painting, the subject, enters the painting, it takes the place of the sitters, the other people, but the reflection of the subject is not visible in the mirror. To see the reflection, the subject must assume the consciousness of the sitters, the other people whose reflection is in the mirror. The subject, the viewer, is only present as an absence, and the consciousness of the subject, the cogito, is only given by the consciousness of the other people. The subject becomes the network of signifiers and language, which is the dream. The subject finds itself in the layers of images and dreams in which the network of signifiers is played out. The optical model of the dream in the intersection of the imaginary and symbolic consists of a number of layers permeable to something analogous to light whose refraction changes from layer to layer. This is the locus where the affair of the subject of the unconscious is played out, Lacan says. This something analogous to light is as an inner light, as it were, a reflection of the perceived light of the ideal ego in the imaginary, in the mnemic residue of perception, the construction of which forms the imaginary subject in relation to the symbolic. The inner light which is perceived is that which is other than given by reason and perception, or the symbolic, or the ideal ego, but the primordial ego of the imaginary. The ideal ego. The symbolic is the ego ideal, the imaginary the ideal ego. Hegel defines the inner light as that which is shapeless and formless, thus that which is given by something other than sense certainty, perception, or consciousness, that which does not correspond to the mnemic residues of perception. In the phenomenology of Hegel, light as shapelessness is the pure, all-embracing and all-pervading essential light of sunrise, which pervades itself in its formless substantiality, as he describes. The genesis of the being for self of spirit, objective spirit, or reason, consists of torrents of light, while the return into the being itself in itself of spirit from the moments of its existence, the manifestation in particulars, is given by perception, as in the return to the primordial imaginary from the temporal symbolic, consists of streams of fire destructive of structured form, that which is given by language. Lacan describes the layers of the optical model of the dream through which the matrix of the symbolic is filtered in the form of the subject, and through which the inner light of the primordial ego is refracted, as an immense display, a special specter situated between perception and consciousness. The optical model of the dream is located between the mnemic residues of perception, which produce the dream on the imaginary level, and the symbolic matrix which produces the subject in consciousness or conscious reason. The big other is situated in the interval that separates perception and consciousness, in the chora of the intersection, and it is there that the subject is constituted in the layered apparition of the intersection of the imaginary and symbolic, which in rhetorical terms is the in-between, the locus of the trace. The separation between perception and consciousness is necessary in order for the traces of perception to become mnemic residues, to pass into memory. The traces must be effaced in perception in the temporal and particular mechanisms of objective experience, and must be constituted simultaneously in the signifying synchrony, the universal concept or consciousness. The passage from perception to consciousness is the passage from the particular to the universal, which begins from perception in the particular of the mnemic residue. In the phenomenology of Hegel, perception already takes what is present to it as a universal. Consciousness is already implicated in perception. It is the mnemic residue which differentiates consciousness from perception, which is the discovery of Freud in the analysis of dreams, and which renders consciousness as alienated from the constitution of the subject. The passage from the particular to the universal, from the diachronic to the synchronic, which occurs for Hegel in perception itself, occurs for Freud in the passage from perception to consciousness, from the imaginary to the symbolic, in which is found the constitution of the subject. The perceptions are immediately transformed into a signifying synchrony in that they immediately become signifiers. The layers between perception and consciousness are the layers in which the traces of perception enter the symbolic as signifiers, and the imaginary ego of the subject is objectified as a symbolic. The permeation through the layers thus entails the dialectical process of fragmentation and dispersal, combined with unification and coalescence, and the two-way interaction between the imaginary and symbolic, between image and word. Such a dialectical interaction is present in language and metaphor. What we have here are those functions of contrast and similitude so essential in the constitution of metaphor, which is introduced by a diachrony, Lacan says, and which incorporates both condensation and displacement, as in the dream work. The mechanisms of language reveal the same interstice between perception and consciousness, in which the constitution of the subject is to be found. The definition of the subject between perception and consciousness, as between the imaginary and symbolic, is one of rupture and discontinuity in the lacuna which is present in language, and the gap itself that constitutes awakening. That which passes in the gap between perception and consciousness is that which passes in the gaps in the glissement of the signifying chain in language, what Lacan calls the gaze, the visual equivalent of the glissement between the imaginary and the symbolic. In our relation to things, insofar as this relation is constituted by the way of vision, and Lacan says, and ordered in the figures of representation, something slips, passes, is transmitted from stage to stage, and is always to some degree eluded in it. That is what we call the gaze. The gaze is the presence of absence in perception, the presence of the absence of the subject in perception, as the anchoring point is in signification, and the point at which the subject is defined in relation to the unconscious. The relation of the subject to the big other is entirely produced in a process of gap, says Lacan, in both perception and language, in both the imaginary and symbolic, and in particular in the intersection between them, as they are always interrelated. The images in the dream, the transposition of the mnemic residue of perception, are the Vorstellungsrepresentanzen described by Freud, which is not a representative, according to Lacan, but that which takes place of the representation between perception and consciousness, the gap in which the subject is constituted. The Vorstellungsrepresentanz is located in the schema of the original mechanisms of alienation, and that first signifying coupling that enable us to conceive that the subject appears first in the big other in the signifying chain, the product of which is the elision, the Aphanisis of the subject. The subject is divided because as soon as it appears in the signifying chain, as represented by a signifier, it disappears, in the same way that the mnemic residue of perception disappears when it is inserted into the signifying chain of the dream and is replaced by the Vorstellungsrepresentanz. The Vorstellungsrepresentanz is as the pronoun in language, that which replaces the absent subject in the symbolic, thus the divided subject. The Vorstellungsrepresentanz is as the binary signifier in the metaphor, which is the process of condensation and displacement. In the process, produces signification by substituting the name of one thing for something else, and an idea is formed in the combination of two names. In the glissement, the signified is transferred from one signifier to another in what is called signifying substitution in the binary signifier. The idea, the subject, is produced in the gap between signifiers at the point de capital, the intersection of the imaginary and symbolic vectors in the L schema, and the retroactive anticipation of presence. At the anchoring point, sense emerges from nonsense, Lacan says. As the Vorstellungsrepresentanz is the binary signifier in the metaphoric process of condensation and displacement and the formation of the dream, as that which takes the place of the representation, it is the supersession of the signifier in condensation between the imaginary and symbolic, which creates the point of attraction, the point de capital, through which the unconscious is momentarily revealed, and which creates repression in the Unterdrückend of the signifier, which is the Vorstellungsrepresentanz. It is that which occurs in the gap between imaginary and symbolic, between perception and consciousness, which is repressed, and the Vorstellungsrepresentanz, which is that which takes the place of the representation, and the glissement, which occurs in the in-between, and the in-between which occurs in the glissement in the intersection of the imaginary and symbolic. Signification occurs in the Vorstellung, Hegel's picture thinking, while the representation occurs in the imaginary. The imaginary exists in the intersubjective relation, in the ideal ego through which the subject identifies itself in relation to the other, based on the Gestalt image attained in the mirror stage. The imaginary also exists in perception and consciousness, outside the big other which constitutes the subject in the unconscious, in the ideal ego and the mechanisms of thought. The ego is a product of the relation with the other person, the necessity of intersubjectivity. The subject is discordant in its ability to identify itself as the image reflected by the other person in relation to its own disappearance in language, which preserves the existence of the other person to the subject. The ego, the mechanism of thought, is itself an object which appears in the world of objects. Consciousness, the self-identity of the subject with its ego, is defined as a tension between the ego, which has been alienated from the subject in its experience and language, and then the impossibility of its relation to the other person, and the perception on the part of the subject which is external to ego, the primordial object identification prior to the mirror stage, seizing or receiving. In primordial object identification, the subject would be strictly identical to this perception if there weren't this ego which makes it emerge from out of its very perception in a relationship of tension. Under certain conditions, this imaginary relation itself reaches its own limit, and the ego fades away, dissipates, becomes disorganized, dissolves, Lacan says. For Lacan, the subject is always fragmented in the relation between the primordial object identification and language. The gap between the object identification and language, between the particular and universal, between the signifier and the signified, between the imaginary and symbolic, is defined as desire. Desire is the product of the impossibility of the imaginary and the symbolic, the splitting of the subject between identification with the other person and identification in the big other of language, the splitting in which the unconscious is formed, and the repression of desire is misrecognition, meconnaissance, which is the only recourse of the subject. The splitting occurs in the processes of language and metaphor and metonymy as the impossible representation of what the subject cannot know as itself. As Lacan writes, it is the concrete incidence of the signifier in the submission of need to demand which, by repressing desire into the position of the misrecognized, gives the unconscious its order. Desire is maintained by language, as is the dehiscence of the subject and the possibility of the unconscious, as it is the nature of desire to be radically torn, says Lacan.